Let me ask you this. Have you ever been too lazy to create documentation for your code, even though you probably should be doing it while you're coding? Because eventually, if you want people to use your code, well, they need to understand your code. And so documentation is a way for you to get other people to understand your code. But it is a time-consuming task, and it's something that not a lot of people do while they're writing their code. What if we could automate that now that GPT-3 and OpenAI exists? So the nice thing about OpenAI and GPT-3 is that it is capable of taking in code and evaluating it to a high degree of accuracy. And of course, there is some room for error, but for the most part, it's very good at interpreting code to the point that it is being used to comment code, create code, and fix code. But yes, it is now also possible to auto document your projects. So here's an implementation that I created that just does that. And it is also integrated with Notion so that you can make documentation on Notion. And all you have to do is define a documenter.js file and then put all these configuration properties. This might look a little intimidating, but it's a rather simple process. You need to put in your OpenAI key so that we can utilize OpenAI, and then your Notion key so that we can integrate with Notion. And here are some filters, some folders that we'd like to ignore. Of course, I don't want it to parse through all my modules and node modules and VS Code and Git ignore. So all these things aren't necessary for me to document. And I can also ask OpenAI to summarize it. It's not necessary, but you can if you want. But the whole point of it is to document. So part of the summarization is also the documentation. I should probably change that to something more fitting for what it actually does, because it also documents. But yes, if you want OpenAI to summarize and document, you would just set this value to true, and then you would also have another configuration object just for Notion so that you have a place to store it specifically on your Notion workspace. Let me go ahead and fill these keys in. I'm gonna go ahead and pause real quick. Now that I have my credentials in, you guys could look at my page ID, but I'm not going to show you guys my keys. This is pretty much all you need to do in order to save and document things in Notion. So basically, this parses through all your project folders and your project files, and then it creates a tree out of it. So the tree kind of looks like this. Here's an example of one. So the tree contains the name of the file, the number of characters it has, and also a summary that is provided to us by OpenAI, and also a direct path to the file. If you want to do any more things with the code, that's also possible. What's nice about the documentation partly being stored in your system as a JSON object is that you can extend the functionalities of this library through the JSON that it outputs. So you can do more with this JSON object now that you have data to work with. But you can also put it on Notion, which I do right here. Sees, you could see that after we generate the tree, I also created a functionality to get a quote, just very rough estimation of how much it would cost if you were to use OpenAI service. So here I'm saying that if the quote is 50 cents or more, then don't use OpenAI to summarize. So the documentation process actually happens here. This is just to generate the tree without the summary, but this is to actually create a summary, because in order for you to actually have a serious documentation, you ought to have a summary of your code along with the breakdown of the interfaces in your code or the functions or whatnot. And so once that's made, so this is asynchronous function, you get a tree to work with, and you can save that tree to Notion, and that tree essentially saves as a folder or page structure on Notion containing all the information on the JSON file. So here's an example. Let's go ahead and run it. Oops. So right now the estimated price for this documentation using OpenAI is about 12 cents, which is pretty good. But hey, this is doing it automatically. We're documenting your code automatically, and I'm just sitting here in my butt allowing OpenAI to look through my code and interpret it and then document it for me. And so I have about 6 files that are relevant for documentation. This might be a little bit of a lengthy process, but it's certainly less time than if you were to sit down and do it yourself. And if you insist on doing it yourself, you can actually just use this service to start with a template and then, fix things up. And so it helps you in that way. It makes it more efficient in that way. So now that we've asked OpenAI to summarize and document the files, you can actually see the local documentation in form of a JSON. And now the summary fields are filled in. We have our documentation here. So this is the breakdown of the actual documentation library or documenter library that I created. So I asked it to document itself. So let's take a look at the documentation. And as you can see, this is all generated by OpenAI, and it was able to successfully actually break down each of the functions in my code and what it does, actually, what it returns. It's just amazing. This is wrong. And I just want to be transparent with that. There is some discrepancy here. Get quote is not a value between 0 and 1, but this is easy for me to change. But for the most part, this is right. This is right. This is right. Yeah, this is pretty accurate. So I would just need to scrub through what OpenAI has summarized and read it and then change things up, and then I have a fully fledged documentation. I'm still working on formatting this, and I do need help in that regard. So if anyone can assist me with that, that would be amazing. One last thing is I never ever specified what kind of file it's reading. So OpenAI just, in a sense, knows that what it's reading is a JavaScript file, and it was able to correctly parse it. So I could actually have different kinds of file. This doesn't only work for JavaScript. This actually works for any arbitrary file. And since this is using OpenAI through their API, I can, in a sense, project that it'll get better over time as OpenAI advances their tech. GPT-3 or whatever newer model comes down the line will be much more better. And in extension, this service that I'm using right now will also become much more better. It'll be better at summarizing, it'll be better at interpreting, and maybe the error rate will close. Maybe someday it'll be nearly perfect, way better than a human. Anyways, the GitHub repository to this library or module is down below in the description. Or you could reach out to me personally, and I'll be happy to hand it over to you, and you can come up with your own implementation. But if this is useful to you, and if you think this might help you with your own project, please feel free to use it. And yeah, Merry Christmas, guys.